eerie coincidence. I've been tweeting about our lamentable national anthem and regretting that we don't have one as glorious as La Marseillaise. And we should, in fact, be playing that tonight, because if it wasn't for an accident of history, that would be, in fact, our national anthem. The music you heard was from Astrolabe, a new work by the Australian pianist and composer Cody. Chris is in the studio with me. He's managed to weave his way through the federal police, and I'm very grateful that he showed that courage. Let me just remind you that the French sailed into Botany Bay in January 1788, just days after the landing of the First Fleet. So we could have had that sliding doors moment where we would be bringing you this little wireless program in French. Chris is very well aware of this, and he's just written a suite inspired by the story of La Pérouse, the French count who set out to explore the Pacific in 1785 on the orders of Louis, and who sailed into Botany Bay just days after Captain Arthur Phillip. And Chris has kindly popped into the studio to tell us about his inspiration. What drew you to the story of this remarkable aristocrat?
Well, it goes back to a while, of course. I've lived in France for many years, and I had heard about him there amongst other French navigators, such as Bougainville. As I say, there's quite a few French navigators. The Dutch also came down to these waters many times, the Portuguese, the Spanish. So just reading generally, I'd always found that period, the 18th century, particularly fascinating. And then when I moved back after many years living in France to Sydney, Australia, just 5 years ago, I found myself living in Maroubra, which is just up the road from La Pérouse. So I'd go down to La Pérouse.
This is the forces of destiny.
It was, wasn't it? Exactly. And I'd go down there and I'd get an ice cream from that lonely ice cream van that sits on the headland. And I, found myself contemplating, well, why is it called La Pérouse? And, sort of did a little investigation and read some more and found the whole story absolutely fascinating. And in some ways it mirrored my own story, which also struck a resonance.
Why was La Pérouse chosen to lead such a vitally important expedition?
Well, he'd already illustrated himself in the American War of Independence in the around 1770, and so he had fought on the side of the American colonials who were rebelling against England, of course. He had ferried money at one point to them. He'd met Washington, and then he'd also demonstrated not only his brilliance militarily, but also in terms of navigation in the Bay of Hudson, which is where Ontario and Quebec is. And he launched a surprise attack on two British forts, won the day, and instead of killing them all or just throwing them out and leaving them to fend for themselves in a rough Canadian winter, he actually left food, clothing and some muskets so that they could actually survive and get back to other British forts.
Chris,
so
he's absolutely, isn't he, a man of the Enlightenment?
He is indeed, exactly. So he'd illustrated himself as being a man who you could trust for such an important expedition. And Louis XVI was very interested in science at the time. Apparently, he was a bit of an odd type, and so he put together. He ordered this extraordinary expedition that took 3.5 to 4 years.
It was also wonderfully. Well, there's some terrific people on it. I'm suddenly reminded of when Napoleon went to Egypt and, of course, took all the savants with him to really do a great job on Egypt alone.
That's right. Well, the Âge de Lumière or the Enlightenment was still very much being felt in France. And you see that it's funny, as you mentioned, Napoleon, he was very interested in science and history. And in fact, who knows how things might have turned out, because he was a mathematician, very interested in science, as I say. He actually applied to be on this expedition at the age of 16 as a young cadet. I read that.
Cadet. I found that extraordinary.
Yeah, because his skills, of course, would have been much in demand in the Navy. Artillery skills and maths, it would have been perfect, but he was rejected. They didn't take him, and who knows how history might have turned out in Europe if, in fact, he'd gone.
Now, we're looking at a journey of a scientific expedition rather than a voyage of conquest.
That's right. This expedition was very much about expanding knowledge, improving the maps and the charts at the time. La Pérouse was a great admirer of Captain James Cook, and that Cook's expedition, of course, had got everyone taking notice. And so the French thought, well, let's go and find out a little bit as well, see what we can add to this body of knowledge. La Pérouse went to London to actually buy, with Joseph Banks' help, and get some of Cook's original instruments. The way he treated scurvy was, of course, fascinating to them and very useful.
Onto that.
And so the French wanted to study the maps, set up new scientific experiments, also examine trading routes, see if they could increase commerce in whaling and fur, and no doubt also explore the possibility of setting up potential colonies or outposts themselves.
So he was to study everything from climate to native peoples, plants, animals, collect specimens, artefacts. And for this, there were 2 500-ton transport vessels.
That's right, yes, which were then equipped to be called frigates, but they actually were supply ships, and they were heavily loaded with all sorts of minerals, scientific experiments, provisions for the journey, goods to barter with the indigenous peoples along the way. You can imagine they were going to be at sea for 4 years.
Do you know
well, I think they had all sorts of like silver goods, but also jewelry, beads, food. So it was, it's quite fascinating. As I've bought, actually, this is the actual ship journal. This is one volume
hold
of
it up to the microphone.
Yeah, that's right. Can you see it, everyone, through the microphone? But it's been a fascinating read. And this was, in fact, given to me by a wonderful old lady living at Little Bay who'd heard that I was writing this music about La Pérouse and thought, this man, he's got to have this. It's the actual ship journal in a lovely edition with engravings and everything from La Pérouse's expedition.
You have a very significant international reputation as a composer and performer, but I understand that for a while you were thinking of writing a book.
Yes, but not about La Pérouse. I've dabbled in writing on and off over the years. I've written a couple of bad poems, a couple of short stories, but no, I wasn't planning to write a book about this. It was always going to be a musical setting. There already are 1 or 2 books out about La Pérouse. It's also featured in 1 or 2 films and TV series. But aside from that, not that much is known about it. So for me, the goal was definitely to be inspired by this journey. It wasn't to do an exact literal setting in music, but no doubt, of course, I've inspired myself from some of the places that he visited, Japan, Korea. Those flavours and sounds and perfumes come through in the music.
My guest is Chris Cody, and this is Ellie Nell on RN, coming to you on this occasion from a secret studio buried deep beneath the city of Sydney, because we know, no, it's not. It's okay. I just had a close call then. I should point out that you'll be doing a concert at Riverside Theatres on August the 11th, and the Melbourne actor Simon Wilton will be reading extracts from the Ship Journal. That's right, yes. He's going to be doing a little narrating and reading some extracts from the journal. There are also going to be visual projections of seascapes and night skies. Some of the engravings also that, as I say, they went off with 6 artists. That was the amazing thing about this expedition too. They really were interested in recording everything. So there's some extraordinary engravings in the Ship's Journal. You might ask, by the way, since they shipwrecked and were never seen again, how did the Ship's Journal survive? You're rushing into that part. Oh, you've jumped the gun.
Oh, my apologies.
Spoiler alert. Heavens above.
But it did survive, needless to say.
Yeah, no, well, I had no idea how extensive the voyage was. Yes. I mean, heavens, he was in Easter Island. He was all over the place.
That's right. And they were the first, they actually chartered Maui in Hawaii, modern-day Hawaii. And again, an interesting comparison perhaps with the British expeditions at the time is that La Pérouse writes in his journal, we could have claimed it for France, but what would be the point of that? How absurd when there were clearly people living there. So
there was no terra nullius argument.
No, that's right. And at any rate, Australia was not terra nullius. It was known already by the Dutch. I've had this argument so many times with Australians, especially in the current climate where we hear a lot about James Cook, who was an extraordinary person and an amazing navigator and of great historical importance, but we don't hear so much about all these other absolutely fascinating and in many ways equally important figures.
I hadn't realised, A, that he'd landed on Easter Island, or B, that was his first contact with Indigenous people.
That's right. It was the first such expedition to land at Easter Island, and they met with the people living there. They set about exploring the island. They did wonderful engravings of the stone statues. They even planted some things
I discovered
there.
many years ago that those stone statues are all Malcolm Frasers. The whole island is covered with giant
face.
Malcolm
Yes.
Frasers.
Now that you mention it, yeah.
Now, after Easter Island, he set off to what were the Sandwich Islands and these days Hawaii.
That's right, yes. And it was also, I think, he wanted to see the site where Cook had also landed and was to perish. And from there, I think they went further up to Alaska. Where 12 men perished in strong currents in 2 longboats that were attempting to come back to the main ship. I mean, that's another thing, that such a journey was fraught at all moments with danger. The winds, the storms, the sea, plus you're in lands where you didn't really know what kind of welcome you were going to get. In
these tiny wooden craft.
That's right.
Smaller than dots in the vastness of the ocean.
That's right. A 500-ton frigate sounds big, but actually it's not that big when you look at and likewise when we look at models now of ships like the Bounty or the Endeavour or the Resolution, we realise actually how small they are. And the thought of the indigenous peoples around the world seeing these ships sailing into their bays, checking out their customs,
like
their
a flying
villages.
saucer landing in
That's right.
the Bot Gardens.
Exactly. That's probably the nearest contemporary equivalent. It's like sending someone off to the moon.
I have to ask, he's a man of the Enlightenment. Was he religious?
I don't know. He was educated by the Jesuits. I suspect at the time, yes, he probably would have been. I think most people at the time were. He was born in Albi, which was another small detail that drew me to the story, because I have many friends in the southwest of France, near Albi, which is also where Toulouse-Lautrec is from, by the way, but that's just an aside. So it's an interesting area, and that was, just one of many little resonances, as I say, that struck a chord with me, because I had left Australia, gone to France, lived there for many years, then came back. So this idea of setting off, starting again, going to new places, discovering new cultures, new peoples, learning new languages has always been paramount and important to me.
Well, let the record show that after surveying the western shores of North America, as well as Japan, Korea and Siberia, he is then ordered to change course for Botany Bay.
That's right. After letting someone off the boat, which was important, in Siberia, he actually released someone who then, this is something I haven't actually investigated, who made a perilous 1-year journey back through eastern Russia and Siberia, back to France, carrying, of course, the ship journal to that point in time, maps, engravings, and so on. And then they set sail for Botany Bay, heading south. They stopped first in Samoa, where after they'd had storms at sea and a rather difficult time getting that far, and they sent 20 men ashore again in 2 longboats to collect provisions and water. And at first they were cordially received by the locals. But then things turned nasty, and they ran aground, these 2 longboats, and they were set upon, and 12 men were killed and 20 were wounded with spears and stones. And one of the men who was killed was the commander-in-chief of l'Astrolabe, de Langres, and the other man was a philosopher and scientist who was aboard. So 2 great losses amongst the ordinary men, of course, as well. So that was a terrible moment for them after the earlier tragic incident in Alaska. And again, what fascinates me is that La Pérouse didn't order a retaliatory strike or punishment. He saw that was simply, it was bad luck, it was unfortunate, and they left there.
Let's face it, Captain Phillip was no lover of the French. There's a bit of history there. How did he react to the French ship's arrival?
Well, it's interesting. The British had just arrived. The first fleet were in Botany Bay, but there were heavy winds and heavy seas, so the French couldn't actually go through the opening there at Botany Bay. So they were just outside. They, of course, saw each other's ships and their pavillon flying and the sails and all that sort of thing. And then the British sent a boat to, who is that? Oh, yeah, it's 2 French boats. Okay. They'd only been there a few days, and they upped to anchor once the wind had settled a little bit and moved north up to Port Jackson, where, of course, they founded Sydney. The French went into Botany Bay and landed there at Frenchman's Cove, which is, of course, still there, at La Pérouse. And then after a couple of days, the British sent some officers down, and they met with the French, and apparently they all got on very well.
There's a wonderful story that the last words of King George V were "Bugger Bognor." I won't go into why he was so unpleasant about Bognor.
Was that the Mad George V? No, is that the earlier one?
You're interrupting the flow here. I did mention that extraordinary story about Louis XVI's final words being, "Is there any news of La Pérouse?" True or apocryphal, do you think?
Both. And the again, fascinating story, because they were last seen by the British, from South Head, sailing north. They had intended to go up to Noumea and eventually make their way home. And in fact, they shipwrecked at Vanukoru, which is just south of the Solomon Islands. And of course, in those days, with sea travel taking rather a long amount of time, meanwhile, the French Revolution came along. Louis XVI was led after a couple of years and in interminable debates and court cases, and finally they decided to behead him. And they were his famous last words as he was led to the guillotine. And it was years before, in fact, they discovered what had happened to this expedition.
Okay, now we can talk about the mystery, about the disappearance of La Pérouse. Take us through that.
Well, after apparently, and as I say, this was established many years later, there was an Irish captain, sounds like a bit of a rogue, who was travelling the South Seas, probably doing a bit of whaling, a bit of trading, and who knows what else, who landed at the Solomon Islands and saw some locals, natives walking around with swords, beautiful engraved ornate silver swords, and he reported this at a later date to the French, who were sceptical given this Irishman's character, but they did actually give him some money, and he went back with a ship that he organised in Bengal, India, and he went back and in fact found signs of anchors and cannonballs in the reefs before, just off the coast of Vanukoru. So that was 1826. It wasn't confirmed, though, that was actually the 2 boats, Astrolabe and La Boussole, until 1966, I think it was.
Really, as late as that?
Yeah, as late as that. And
how was it confirmed?
Well, the French Navy sent a proper expedition and submarines and divers down, and actually it was when they were able to pull up things and formally identify them as having belonged. But prior to that, they were pretty sure that that's what it was, because they took those swords back to France, and the person I mentioned earlier who'd got off in Siberia and travelled back to Paris, he recognised those swords as belonging to officers on board.
The French had, of course, searched for La Pérouse and his men.
Yes, that's right. They sent Entrecastot out only 2 years later. Again, this is at the time of the French Revolution, so again, organising an expedition with 2 boats, the men, the captains and so on, to go out and do this would have been costly and difficult. But he didn't find any sign of them. He did go past Vanukoru, but the rough seas and the winds at the time prevented him from landing.
And of course he dies on the mission.
Yes, that's right. He actually he died on that mission. But someone else who also could have become a hero for having discovered what had become of La Pérouse was Captain Edwards, who'd been sent out from England.
Oh, this is the guy on HMS Pandora.
That's right, yes, to find the mutineers of the Bounty, which is, again, another extraordinary story.
Tell me the story. We've just got time.
Oh, great. I'll go quickly. Well, so he sails out. He's looking for the mutineers, and he's sort of heading towards anywhere in the South Pacific. Tahiti, we'll go there. We'll look around the various islands. Norfolk Island, they might be there. And he sailed past Vanukoru, saw smoke coming up from Vanukoru. This is in 1790, so before Entrecastot, only a year and a half, roughly 2 years after they'd gone missing, but assumed it couldn't possibly be the mutineers, because why would they signal and betray their presence with smoke? So he sailed on, And it was almost certainly the few survivors, because the first crew got massacred, apparently butchered by the natives on the island. And the second crew managed to build a barricade, pieced together bits and pieces from one of the surviving boats washed up on the wreck, and they set sail several months later in a longboat in a sail that they managed to build. So, but they were never seen again either. So, as I say, the stories are extraordinary.
It's insufficiently known in Australia. Well, you're doing a great ambassadorial job here. Is he well remembered in France?
It's sad to say he's probably less known than the name of Cook in France, but he is known. I mean, the French do a great job of remembering and honouring their patrimony, their heritage, their patrimoine, as they say in French, in the names of streets, places, squares, and everything. And right here in Sydney, there's interestingly, there's a La Pérouse museum, which of course I've visited several times, down at La Pérouse on the headland there.
Oh, forgive me, I'm ignorant of that.
I believe it's the old cable station or something, opposite where the ferry used to run from one side of Botany Bay to the other. But if you go down there, you've got the Snake Pit, and then you've got this old museum there, just by Frenchman's Cove. And it's also the burial site of Père Receveur, who was the chaplain on board, who died in that skirmish at Samoa, but he died when he arrived in Sydney. So it was the first Christian burial that took place in Australia.
Well, thanks for braving the AFP and reaching me in my secret studio.
Yeah, it was hard getting in, I must say.
I highly recommend the listener goes along to your next live performance of Astrolabe at the Riverside Theatre in Parramatta on the 11th of August, and fading up in the background, no Giuseppe, but with an excerpt from Astrolabe called Mundus Vetus. And coming up tomorrow, an update on PNG and a chat with an acclaimed Brazilian film director, music maestro.